The blizzard had buried every cabin in the valley under 8 feet of snow, roofs collapsing one by one as families screamed for help they couldn't reach. 2 miles up the mountain, Matthias Keller sat beside his fire in perfect warmth, watching through his window as the storm that was killing his neighbors couldn't touch him. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Matthias Keller had survived 8 winters in the Colorado Rockies by the time he turned 32 years old. That was an accomplishment worth noting in a region where most trappers didn't make it past their 5th season. The mountains killed men with efficient regularity through grizzly attacks, falls from cliffs, drownings in swift creeks, freezing during unexpected storms, and dozens of other ways the wilderness found to eliminate the careless or unlucky. Matthias had avoided all of these fates through a combination of careful planning and methodical execution that his fellow trappers found almost boring in its predictability. He had emigrated from Baden in the German states in 1834, arriving in St. Louis with carpentry skills learned from his father and enough money saved to outfit himself for the fur trade. Unlike many young men who rushed west with romantic notions of adventure, Matthias treated trapping as a profession, requiring the same attention to detail his father had demanded in furniture making. He studied maps before selecting territory. He maintained his equipment obsessively. He cached supplies in multiple locations against emergency. He avoided unnecessary risks and returned to St. Louis each spring with consistent profits from high-quality pelts. By 1842, he had established himself along the upper tributaries of the Colorado River in what would later become the northwestern part of Colorado Territory. The region was remote enough to offer good trapping without the overcrowding that had depleted beaver populations in more accessible areas. Matthias had built a serviceable cabin near a creek junction, established productive trap lines, and developed a reputation among the scattered community of trappers as someone who could be relied upon for accurate information and fair dealing. That winter, he had partnered with Ernst Vogel, another German immigrant who had arrived in the Rockies 2 years earlier. Ernst was younger, 26 years old, and more inclined toward the adventurous aspects of mountain life that Matthias had learned to treat with caution. But Ernst was also hardworking and honest, qualities Matthias valued above personality compatibility. They had agreed to combine their efforts for the season, sharing a camp and splitting profits equally. The partnership worked well through the autumn and early winter months. They worked their trap lines systematically, processed pelts with care, and maintained their camp efficiently. Ernst's enthusiasm balanced Matthias's caution in ways that made both men more effective. They talked in the evenings about their families back in the German states, about plans for the future, about whether the fur trade would last another decade given the changing fashions in the East. Ernst wanted to save enough money to bring his younger brother to America. Matthias was considering investing in land somewhere less isolated, perhaps starting a sawmill where his carpentry skills would prove valuable. Neither man anticipated that their partnership would end in February, or that the manner of its ending would change how Matthias understood survival in the mountains. February 18th, 1843. Began as an unremarkable winter day in the Colorado high country. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, cold but not dangerously so. A few clouds drifted across the pale blue sky. Ernst left the cabin just after dawn to check their northern trap line, a route that typically required 4 to 5 hours to complete. Matthias stayed at camp to process pelts from the previous day's collection and repair a pair of snowshoes that had cracked during recent use. They expected Ernst back by early afternoon. The weather changed with startling speed around mid-morning. Matthias noticed the shift when the temperature dropped suddenly and wind began gusting from the northwest. Within 30 minutes, snow was falling heavily and visibility had decreased to less than 50 yards. Mountain storms could develop with little warning, but the intensity of this system concerned Matthias immediately. He built up the fire in the cabin and prepared hot coffee, expecting Ernst to return soon seeking warmth. By mid-afternoon, Ernst had not appeared. Matthias stood in the doorway watching the storm intensify. Snow was accumulating rapidly, already 8 inches deep and showing no signs of stopping. The wind had increased to the point where it drove snow horizontally across the clearing. Matthias knew Ernst was competent in winter travel, but he also knew that even experienced men could become disoriented in whiteout conditions. After another hour passed with no sign of his partner, Matthias gathered emergency supplies and headed north along the trapline route. The storm made travel difficult and dangerous. Matthias could barely see landmarks he knew intimately under normal conditions. Snow had already obscured the trail in many places. He called Ernst's name repeatedly, listening between gusts for any response. The temperature continued dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. Matthias pushed forward, fighting growing concern that shifted toward fear as darkness approached. He found Ernst 2 miles from the cabin, collapsed beside a fallen log near one of their trap sets. Ernst had apparently recognized the danger and attempted to return to camp, but the storm had disoriented him. Instead of heading south toward safety, he had traveled east into unfamiliar terrain. By the time he realized his error, he was already suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. He had stopped to rest and never gotten up again. Matthias knelt beside his partner in the failing light and knew immediately that Ernst was dead. The body was already cold, frozen in a sitting position with arms wrapped around knees in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. Snow had begun drifting against Ernst's back. Matthias remained there for several minutes, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he stood, marked the location as best he could in the storm, and fought his way back to the cabin through full darkness. He made it back, barely able to feel his own hands and feet, hypothermia threatening him as well. Matthias returned to Ernst's body the next morning after the storm cleared. He brought a blanket and tools for burial, though the frozen ground made digging impossible. Instead, he carried Ernst back to camp, a brutal 2-mile journey that took most of the day. He wrapped the body carefully and left it in a protected spot until the ground thawed enough for proper burial. The entire process felt mechanical, his mind unable to fully engage with the reality of what had happened. Over the following weeks, Matthias continued working the trap lines alone, completing the season's obligations because stopping would have meant Ernst's final efforts produced nothing. But his attention had shifted away from trapping toward something else. He found himself studying the cabin where they had lived with new eyes. The structure that had seemed adequate now appeared dangerously inadequate. He noticed things he had previously ignored or accepted as normal. The roof sagged slightly under accumulated snow weight. Gaps between logs had widened as the wood dried and settled, creating drafts that the wind exploited. The door fit poorly in its frame, ice forming around the edges where warm air escaped and cold air entered. The entire structure felt temporary and vulnerable in ways Matthias had not recognized before Ernst's death. He realized that if the storm had lasted another day, or if Ernst had made it back to camp but been unable to get inside quickly, the cabin itself might have contributed to tragedy. Matthias began visiting other trappers' camps as he worked his way through the territory. He paid attention to cabin construction with obsessive focus. He saw roofs that had partially collapsed under heavy snow loads. He found abandoned cabins where doors had been torn off by wind or damaged by animals. He noticed how gaps between logs widened over time, how chinking fell out, how structures that seemed solid when first built deteriorated rapidly under mountain conditions. Every weakness he observed fed into a growing conviction that standard building methods were fundamentally flawed. Other trappers noticed the change in Matthias. He asked questions about cabin failures they had experienced or witnessed. He examined construction details with intensity that made people uncomfortable. When someone mentioned losing a cabin to heavy snow or wind damage, Matthias wanted to see the site and understand exactly what had failed. People began avoiding these conversations, finding Matthias's fixation morbid and strange. They assumed he was processing grief in an unhealthy way. But Matthias was not dwelling on death. He was studying survival. Ernst had died from hypothermia, brought on by storm exposure and disorientation. But the underlying problem was that their cabin offered no real protection if you could not reach it, and even reaching it provided only marginal advantage over being caught in the open. In April of 1843, Matthias left the mountains to sell his winter's collection of pelts in Taos. The journey south took 12 days and gave him time to think without the immediate demands of daily survival. He sold the furs for a modest profit, settled Ernst's share with a trading company that would forward payment to Ernst's family in Germany, and spent 3 days in town not drinking or gambling like most trappers, but walking through the settlement, studying buildings. Taos had adobe structures that had stood for decades, thick walls that moderated temperature extremes, flat roofs designed to shed snow, small windows that minimized heat loss. Matthias recognized principles in Pueblo architecture that mountain cabins ignored. Weight distribution, thermal mass, protection from wind. These concepts were built into structures that had evolved over centuries in harsh climates. He wondered if similar principles could be adapted to log construction in the mountains. He returned to the Colorado high country in May with a different focus. Instead of immediately resuming trapping preparations, Matthias spent weeks traveling through the region studying not cabins, but geology. He examined cliff faces, rock overhangs, cave formations, and natural shelters. He paid attention to where snow accumulated and where it did not. He noticed that certain cliff orientations shed snow, while others collected massive drifts. He observed that rock faces absorbed heat during sunny days and radiated warmth for hours after sunset. Other trappers thought he had lost his mind. Men who encountered Matthias found him examining rock formations with the intensity most people reserved for gold prospecting. He made sketches in a journal, crude drawings of cliff angles and overhang measurements. He climbed to examine overhangs from above, checking for cracks or instability that might indicate collapse risk. He spent entire days sitting and watching how weather interacted with different geological features. Thomas Garrett, a trapper who had worked the region for 15 years, encountered Matthias in late May examining a massive granite overhang. Garrett watched with confusion as Matthias measured the overhang's depth with a length of rope, noted the orientation with a compass, and studied the rock face for cracks. When Garrett asked what he was doing, Matthias explained he was looking for a building site. Garrett pointed out that the location was 2 miles from the nearest water source and 1,000 feet above good trapping territory. Matthias nodded and continued his measurements. Garrett left convinced that grief had broken something in the German trapper's mind. But Matthias had identified something others missed. Standard cabin construction fought against mountain weather with inadequate tools. Wood structures tried to bear loads they could not support and seal against wind they could not stop. Matthias found the perfect location in early June of 1843, on a ridge overlooking the valley where most trappers maintained their camps. The site sat at an elevation of approximately 8,500 feet, high enough to command views of the surrounding territory, but below the tree line where winter winds would be devastating. What made the location exceptional was not the elevation or view, but the massive granite cliff that dominated the northern side of the ridge. The cliff face rose nearly 200 feet from the ridge floor, weathered stone that had stood for millennia without visible deterioration. But the feature that captured Matthias's attention was the overhang. Approximately 40 feet above the ridge surface, the cliff face angled outward, creating a sheltered area beneath it. The overhang extended 25 feet from the cliff face, creating a natural roof of solid stone. The protected area beneath measured roughly 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, a space large enough to build a substantial cabin completely sheltered from above. Matthias spent 3 days examining the site from every angle. He climbed above the overhang to check for cracks or fracture lines that might indicate instability. The rock was solid granite, the overhang formed by differential weathering that had occurred over thousands of years. There were no signs of recent rockfall, no loose sections that might break free. The cliff face itself showed water staining that indicated snowmelt patterns. During heavy snow, the overhang shed its load outward, away from the cliff face, rather than allowing accumulation. The site's orientation was equally important. The cliff faced south, meaning the overhang faced north. This created a protected area that received indirect sunlight during most of the day, but avoided the harsh direct exposure that could make southern-facing shelters unbearably hot in summer. The cliff would block northern winds, the most dangerous weather in this region. The ridge's elevation provided natural drainage, preventing water accumulation during snowmelt or rain. The practical disadvantages were obvious. Water sources were distant, requiring a steep climb down to the nearest creek approximately half a mile away. The site was isolated from the small trapping community in the valley below, meaning Matthias would have limited contact with other people during winter months. Hauling building materials and supplies to the ridge would require significant effort. The location was completely impractical by conventional standards. Matthias returned to the valley and mentioned his building plans to several trappers. Their reactions ranged from confusion to outright mockery. Jacob Webster, who had trapped the region for 8 years, pointed out that building 2 miles from water was insane. Michael Fraser asked why anyone would choose to live like a hermit in a cave when flat ground near the creek offered easy building sites. Thomas Garrett, who had already questioned Matthias's sanity, simply shook his head and walked away. The criticism didn't bother Matthias. He had learned carpentry from a father who valued precision over speed and durability over convenience. He understood that good work often looked excessive to people who accepted minimal standards. The trappers mocking his site selection had built cabins that barely survived 5 years and offered almost no real protection during severe weather. Their opinions carried no weight. Matthias purchased additional supplies in Taos during a brief trip in late June, unusual items that confused the trading post operator. Matthias began construction in early July of 1843 with a clear vision of what he needed to build and why each element mattered. Unlike standard cabin construction where trappers simply started stacking logs with minimal planning, Matthias spent the first week doing nothing but preparation and detailed planning. He cleared the area beneath the overhang, removing loose rock and debris. He studied how water drained across the site during summer rainstorms. He marked the exact position where the cabin would sit, oriented to maximize thermal advantage while leaving space for outdoor work areas under the overhang's protection. The fundamental innovation in Matthias's design was integration rather than isolation. Standard cabins were freestanding structures that happened to be near natural features but remained separate from them. Matthias intended to build a cabin that was physically part of the cliff, using the geological formation as a structural component rather than simply a backdrop. This approach required thinking about construction in completely different terms than traditional methods. The back wall of the cabin would not exist as a separate element. Instead, the cliff face itself would serve as the back wall. This eliminated the need to build and seal an entire wall, saved materials and labor, and created direct thermal connection between the stone mass and the cabin interior. But it also meant dealing with an irregular surface. The cliff face was not flat or uniform. It had bulges, depressions, and texture that would create gaps if logs were simply placed against it. Matthias solved this problem through careful shaping. He would cut each log to fit the specific section of cliff where it would rest. This was enormously time-consuming compared to standard construction, where logs were simply cut to length and stacked. But the result would be intimate contact between wood and stone, eliminating the massive gaps that plagued standard cabins built against cliff faces for windbreak purposes. The side walls would be conventional log construction, but positioned to form a rectangular space between the cliff and the exterior. The front wall would include the door and window, built with the same careful attention Matthias planned for the sides. But the critical advantage was that he only needed to build 3 walls instead of 4. The saved labor and materials could be invested in making those 3 walls more robust than standard construction. The roof represented the most radical departure from convention. Standard cabins required roofs capable of bearing heavy snow loads because snow would accumulate on them throughout winter. Matthias's roof needed no such capability. The massive stone overhang 25 feet above the building site would prevent any snow from reaching his cabin's roof. His roof only needed to shed rain during summer months and provide modest insulation. This meant he could build a lightweight structure that would be impossible in conventional design. Matthias calculated that he could complete the cabin in approximately 12 to 14 weeks working alone. Standard cabin construction took 4 to 6 days with 2 men working. His timeline would seem absurdly excessive to other trappers. But Matthias was not building a temporary shelter. He was engineering a structure that would function as a thermal system integrated with its geological environment. He began cutting logs in mid-July, selecting trees with obsessive care. The first major construction phase focused on creating a proper foundation, something virtually no mountain cabins possessed. Most trappers simply cleared ground to approximate flatness and started stacking logs directly on soil. This created multiple problems. The structure would settle unevenly as soil compressed under the weight. Moisture from ground contact would rot the lowest logs within a few years. Small animals would burrow underneath, creating entry points. Matthias intended to avoid all of these failures. The cliff face itself was not flat at ground level. It rose at a slight angle, and the surface varied from relatively smooth areas to sections with significant texture. Matthias spent 4 days shaping the ground surface beneath the overhang, using a pry bar and sledgehammer to break away protruding rock and fill depressions with smaller stones. His goal was to create a level surface that would serve as the cabin floor. Not soil that would shift or erode, but solid rock that would remain stable indefinitely. Where the rock surface could not be leveled adequately through removal, Matthias built it up using flat stones he gathered from a scree field half a mile away. He hauled stones up to the site using a canvas sling, carrying loads that weighed 40 to 60 pounds each trip. He made dozens of trips over the course of a week, selecting stones for their flat surfaces and appropriate thickness. Each stone was placed carefully, fitted to its neighbors to minimize gaps, creating a mosaic that would distribute weight evenly. The result was a floor surface that was approximately 20 feet deep from the cliff face to the front wall location and 18 feet wide between where the side walls would stand. The floor was not perfectly flat, but varied no more than 2 inches across its entire surface. More importantly, it was completely solid. No settling would occur. No moisture would wick up from below. No animals could tunnel through stone. Around the perimeter of this floor area, Matthias created a shallow drainage channel, cutting into the rock surface using hammer and chisel. This channel, roughly 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep, would catch any water that entered the cabin or condensed on the walls and direct it away from the structure toward the front, where it would drain off the ridge. The work was tedious, requiring hours of careful chipping to create a channel that sloped consistently toward drainage points. Other trappers who visited the site during this phase questioned why Matthias was wasting time on a stone floor when dirt would serve adequately. Thomas Garrett climbed up to the site in late July and found Matthias chipping at rock with a chisel, covered in stone dust. Garrett asked how long the floor work had taken. Matthias said 3 weeks. Garrett pointed out that he could build an entire cabin in less time. Matthias nodded and continued chipping. Garrett left convinced he was watching a man waste his life on pointless perfection. But Matthias understood something about thermal mass that he could not fully articulate. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. Matthias began raising the side and front walls in early August after completing the foundation work. He had spent 3 weeks cutting and preparing logs, selecting trees with unusual care. Most trappers used whatever timber was convenient, accepting variation in diameter and straightness as normal. Matthias rejected any log that was not remarkably uniform, approximately 14 inches in diameter along its entire length. He stripped bark completely using a draw knife, smoothing the surface until each log was consistent in dimension and texture. The sidewalls required different treatment than standard construction because they needed to connect to an irregular cliff face rather than to another log wall. Matthias addressed this by scribing each log to match the exact contour of the rock surface it would rest against. He would place a log against the cliff, use a compass-like marking tool to trace the rock's irregular profile onto the log, then shape the log's back surface to match that profile using his draw knife and adze. The process took 2 to 3 hours per log. When properly fitted, each log made contact with the cliff face along its entire length, with gaps no larger than ½ an inch at any point. Matthias filled these remaining gaps with a mixture he had prepared from clay gathered near the creek, horsehair obtained by trading with another trapper, and pine resin he had collected and boiled down from sap. This mixture was more durable than standard mud chinking and created an airtight seal between wood and stone. The result was a connection between the logs and cliff that was intimate and thermal. The stone mass of the cliff would conduct heat into the cabin's structure. During sunny days, the cliff face absorbed solar radiation. That heat would transfer through the fitted logs into the interior space. At night, the massive thermal capacity of the cliff would release stored heat gradually, moderating temperature drops that made standard cabins unbearably cold after sunset. The front and opposite side walls used conventional log stacking techniques, but with Matthias's characteristic precision. Each log was shaped to fit tightly against its neighbors above and below. Gaps between logs were minimal, filled with his clay mixture immediately after placement. The corners used a modified dovetail joint that Matthias reinforced with wooden pins driven through multiple logs simultaneously. This created rigid corners that could not shift or separate under stress. By late August, the walls had risen to 7 feet height, the point where Matthias planned to install the roof structure. The cabin's interior dimensions were 18 feet deep from cliff face to front wall and 16 feet wide between side walls. The space felt smaller than it actually was because of the 7-foot ceiling height, but Matthias prioritized heat retention over spaciousness. Smaller volume meant less air to heat during winter months. Visitors continued questioning his methods. The time investment seemed insane to men who built functional cabins in less than a week. But Matthias was building something different than a functional cabin. He was creating a thermal system that used geological mass as a heating element, though he thought of it simply as building properly. The roof construction began in September and represented the most radical departure from standard practice. Every mountain cabin Matthias had examined used heavy roof structures designed to support significant snow loads. Trappers laid thick ridge poles across the width of their cabins, then covered those poles with smaller branches, bark, and sod to create weatherproof covering. The resulting roofs weighed hundreds of pounds even before snow accumulated. During heavy winter storms, these roofs bore additional loads of 500 to 1,000 pounds of snow, which frequently caused structural failure. Matthias's roof needed to support no snow load whatsoever. The massive granite overhang 25 feet above his cabin would prevent snow from reaching his roof. He could build a structure concerned only with summer rain and modest insulation, not with bearing weight. This freed him to use a completely different approach that would seem dangerously inadequate by conventional standards, but was perfectly suited to his specific situation. He started with ridge poles, but instead of using logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter like standard construction, Matthias used poles only 4 inches thick. He selected straight pine saplings, stripped them, and laid them across the width of the cabin, spaced 2 feet apart. These poles rested on the top logs of the front and side walls, but did not connect to the cliff face. The entire roof structure was independent of the stone, allowing for differential movement between wood and rock as temperatures changed. Across these ridge poles, Matthias laid split planks he had shaped using a froe and mallet. The planks were pine, split along the grain to create pieces approximately 3 inches wide and half an inch thick. He overlapped them like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. The planks were not nailed or pegged to the ridge poles, but simply laid in place, held by their own weight and the overlapping pattern. This created a flexible roof that could expand and contract with temperature changes without creating stress points that might crack or split. Over the planks, Matthias laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. He had collected the bark during summer, stripping it from dead birch trees in long sheets. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, resistant to rot even when constantly wet. He positioned the bark with the white outer surface facing up to reflect summer sun, minimizing heat buildup in the cabin during hot months. The bark layers overlapped by at least 6 inches at every seam, creating a redundant weatherproofing system where water that penetrated one layer would be stopped by the layer below. The entire roof structure weighed less than 200 pounds, a fraction of what standard cabin roofs weighed, but it was completely adequate for its purpose. Rain would run off the overlapping bark and planks. The insulation value was modest but sufficient, and most importantly, the structure existed under complete protection from the massive stone roof that nature had provided millions of years earlier. Matthias completed the roof installation in 5 days, remarkably fast compared to his painstaking work on walls and foundation. The fireplace construction occupied most of October and demonstrated Matthias's understanding of heat dynamics, though he conceptualized these principles through practical observation rather than scientific theory. He positioned the fireplace against the cliff face in the back corner of the cabin where stone mass was greatest. This location was unconventional. Most trappers built fireplaces on exterior walls to vent smoke easily. Matthias deliberately chose to integrate his fireplace with the thermal mass of the cliff. He gathered flat stones from a creek bed 2 miles away, selecting pieces that would stack stably and withstand repeated heating without cracking. Sandstone and granite worked well. Shale and limestone were rejected because they tended to fracture under thermal stress. He hauled stones to the site over the course of 2 weeks, making multiple trips daily with loads carried in a canvas sling. The total weight of stone he moved exceeded 2,000 pounds. The fireplace design was simple but effective. He built a firebox 18 inches deep, 24 inches wide, and 20 inches tall. The back and sides were stone stacked without mortar, fitted carefully so gaps were minimal. The front was open for loading wood and managing the fire. Above the firebox, Matthias constructed a stone chimney that rose 6 feet to meet the underside of his wooden roof, then transitioned to a clay and stone extension that continued up through the roof and terminated 2 feet above the highest point. The critical innovation was how the fireplace interacted with the cliff face. Matthias built the entire structure directly against the rock, ensuring intimate contact between the fireplace stones and the cliff. When he burned fires, heat would transfer from the firebox through the stone structure into the cliff face itself. The rock would absorb this heat and retain it for hours. Long after the fire burned down, the cliff face would continue radiating warmth into the cabin interior. He enhanced this effect deliberately during the first weeks of use. Matthias burned fires frequently during late October and November, more than necessary for cooking or immediate warmth. The smoke from these fires blackened the cliff face above and around the fireplace, creating a dark surface where the stone had been light gray. This blackened surface absorbed heat more efficiently than bare rock. When sunlight entered through the window or door and struck the blackened cliff face, it converted to heat that the stone mass stored and released gradually. The system worked through thermal momentum. Once the cliff face behind the fireplace warmed up, it required less fuel to maintain comfortable interior temperatures. The stone acted as a thermal battery, storing heat during periods when the fire burned hot and releasing it during periods when the fire was low or extinguished. Matthias found that he could maintain comfortable warmth overnight with coals, something impossible in standard cabins where temperatures dropped precipitously once active flames ceased. Other principles contributed to the system's efficiency. The cabin's small volume meant less air needed heating. The careful chinking eliminated drafts that pulled warm air out. The stone floor absorbed heat from the fireplace and released it upward. The area beneath the granite overhang extended 15 feet beyond the cabin's front wall, creating a naturally sheltered zone that Matthias recognized as equally valuable as the cabin interior itself. This protected space remained dry during rain and snow, shielded from above by solid rock. Most trappers would have ignored this area or used it casually for random storage. Matthias planned its use with the same methodical attention he applied to every aspect of the site. He designated the eastern section of the overhang area for firewood storage. Wood was critical for winter survival, and maintaining an accessible supply during heavy snow was often the difference between life and death. Standard cabin designs placed firewood outside with no protection, where it became buried under snowdrifts or soaked by rain. Retrieving buried firewood during blizzards was dangerous and exhausting work. Matthias's protected storage eliminated this problem entirely. He built a firewood rack using logs set vertically into holes he drilled into the stone floor. Horizontal supports connected these uprights, creating a framework that held split wood organized by size. He could stack cord after cord under the overhang, completely protected from weather. Snow that blew in horizontally during storms would accumulate at the front edge of the protected zone, but never reach the wood storage area set back against the cabin wall. The western section became his work area. Matthias constructed a sturdy table from split logs, positioning it where he could work during daylight hours even in poor weather. The overhang provided enough light for detailed work like equipment repair, hide processing, and tool maintenance. He could work outside in relative comfort during rain or light snow, conditions that would force other trappers to crowd into their dark cabin interiors or postpone necessary tasks. He built additional storage racks for equipment and supplies along the cabin's front wall. These held traps when not in use, maintained tools, spare rope, canvas tarps, and dozens of other items that needed protection from weather, but not necessarily the warmth of the cabin interior. Having these items accessible in the protected zone meant he could gear up for trapline rounds without having to bring all equipment inside, keeping the cabin interior cleaner and more organized. The overhang area also served defensive purposes, though Matthias did not emphasize this aspect to visitors. The protected zone gave him space to observe approaches to the cabin while remaining sheltered. He could stand in this area during storms with complete protection, watching the valley below or monitoring weather conditions. If dangerous animals or hostile humans approached, he would see them before they reached the cabin itself and could retreat inside with warning time. By early November, Matthias had organized the entire overhang area into a functional extension of his living space. Firewood was stacked 6 cords deep. Tools hung on pegs. His work table was equipped with basic equipment kept in good repair. The entire system reflected his characteristic approach of anticipating needs and preparing solutions before problems arose. Other trappers who visited found the organization excessive and vaguely unsettling, suggesting someone who expected disaster. Matthias moved into his completed cabin in mid-November of 1843, 4 months after beginning construction. The timeline was extraordinary by frontier standards, where functional cabins were built in days, not months. Word of his construction project had spread through the scattered trapping community, and the time investment became a source of both curiosity and mockery among men who valued efficiency and practicality. Thomas Garrett calculated that Matthias had invested approximately 500 hours of labor into a structure that provided the same basic function as a cabin, requiring perhaps 30 hours of work. The mathematics seemed to prove Matthias was either incompetent or insane. Jacob Webster pointed out that the 4 months spent building could have been used trapping, potentially earning $200 or more in pelts. Instead, Matthias had earned nothing while exhausting himself on construction. The cabin acquired a nickname among the trapping community. Men called it Keller's Cave, a term that was not quite respectful. The name referenced both the cliff integration and the implication that Matthias had retreated from normal human society into isolated primitiveness. When trappers discussed the structure, they used it as an example of excessive effort, a cautionary tale about losing perspective on what actually mattered in mountain life. The financial cost had been substantial beyond just lost trapping time. Matthias had purchased specialized tools that standard cabin builders never needed. His draw knife, adze, froe, and various chisels represented significant investment. He had traded valuable supplies for horsehair to mix into his chinking compound. He had spent money on iron hardware for hinges and reinforcement brackets that other trappers considered wasteful luxury. The total monetary cost exceeded what most trappers spent building 3 or 4 standard cabins over multiple years. Michael Fraser visited the completed structure in late November and openly questioned Matthias's judgment. Fraser had built 2 cabins during the same 4 months, one for himself and one for a new trapper who paid him in supplies for the service. He had also worked his trap line successfully throughout the construction period, already accumulating significant pelts for eventual sale. Fraser could not understand why anyone would sacrifice so much time and money for marginal improvements over standard design. Matthias did not argue with these criticisms. He acknowledged that his approach was slower and more expensive than conventional methods. But he also knew that his cabin addressed problems that conventional designs could not solve. The thermal mass integration, the protected storage, the weatherproof construction, these features had specific purposes that would become apparent when tested by harsh conditions. Until that testing occurred, he could not prove his investment was worthwhile. He simply knew that standard cabins had failed Ernst Vogel, and he refused to trust his survival to methods that had proven inadequate. The isolation of his chosen site reinforced the community's judgment that Matthias had made poor decisions. His cabin sat 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, separated by difficult terrain. During winter storms, he would be completely cut off from any assistance or social contact. The winter of 1843 to 1844 tested Matthias's cabin under conditions that were challenging but not catastrophic. Snow began accumulating in early December and continued intermittently through March. Total snowfall for the season was approximately 8 to 10 feet measured in open areas, which was typical for the elevation and region. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit on multiple occasions, with the coldest night reaching approximately 20 below. These conditions stressed standard cabins significantly, but did not push them to complete failure. Matthias's cliff-integrated design performed exactly as he had anticipated. The massive granite overhang prevented snow accumulation on his roof or in the protected zone in front of his cabin. While valley cabins developed snow loads that compressed roof structures and created leaking problems, Matthias's lightweight roof bore only its own minimal weight throughout the winter. The overhang shed its snow load outward, creating a drift that built up 30 feet from the cliff face but never approached the cabin itself. The thermal mass system exceeded his expectations. Once the cliff face behind the fireplace warmed during the first weeks of regular fires, the cabin maintained comfortable temperatures with remarkably little fuel consumption. Matthias burned approximately 1/3 the firewood that trappers in standard cabins reported using. The stone absorbed heat during evening fires and released it gradually through the night. Morning temperatures inside the cabin typically remained 15 to 20 degrees warmer than exterior temperatures, even when the fire had burned down to cold ash. The protected storage area proved invaluable during storms. Matthias could access his firewood supply regardless of weather conditions. He never needed to dig through snowdrifts or venture beyond the overhang's shelter to retrieve fuel. His work area remained usable throughout winter for equipment maintenance and hide processing. He could step outside the cabin door for fresh air or to relieve himself without fighting through deep snow or exposing himself to dangerous wind chill. The cabin's tight construction eliminated the drafts that made standard cabins miserable during high winds. Matthias had spent weeks carefully fitting logs and applying superior chinking. The result was a structure that held heat efficiently and prevented cold air infiltration. On nights when wind howled across the ridge, he could hear it outside but barely feel it inside. His neighbors in the valley reported constant drafts that made maintaining warmth nearly impossible during windstorms. Water management worked as designed. The drainage channels he had cut into the stone floor carried away condensation and occasional meltwater that entered around the door. The floor remained dry throughout the winter, eliminating the mud and dampness that plagued dirt floor cabins when interior snowmelt mixed with soil. Everything inside Matthias's cabin stayed organized and dry, preventing mildew and rot problems common in less carefully constructed shelters. The isolation that others had criticized as a weakness proved less problematic than anticipated. Matthias was self-sufficient by nature and did not miss daily social contact. The autumn of 1844 brought unusual weather patterns that experienced trappers recognized as potentially ominous. September remained warmer than normal, with temperatures reaching the 70s even at higher elevations. Then October arrived with sudden cold snaps that dropped temperatures below freezing for several days before warming again. The pattern repeated 3 times during the month, creating freeze-thaw cycles that coated everything in ice and stressed trees with the expansion and contraction. November brought exceptionally heavy early snowfall. By mid-month, the region had received as much snow as typically fell during an entire December. The snow came in intense bursts, separated by clear, cold periods, rather than the steady accumulation normal for the season. Animals behaved strangely as well. Deer moved to lower elevations earlier than usual. Small mammals cached food with unusual urgency. Birds migrated earlier and in larger groups than normal years. Old trappers who had worked the mountains for decades recognized these signs as indicators of severe winter ahead. Thomas Garrett, who had survived 16 winters in the region, told anyone who would listen that the coming season would test every structure and person in the high country. Jacob Webster began reinforcing his cabin roof with additional support poles, convinced that snow loads would exceed normal levels. Michael Fraser stockpiled extra firewood, doubling his usual winter supply. Matthias observed these preparations and the weather patterns with interest. His cliff-integrated cabin had performed well during the previous winter's normal conditions, but he had not yet tested it against truly severe weather. He checked every aspect of his structure during November, looking for any weakness that might fail under extreme stress. He found nothing concerning. The walls remained tight, the chinking intact, the roof sound. The thermal mass system had proven itself during the previous winter and would only become more valuable if temperatures dropped to extreme lows. He offered to help other trappers reinforce their structures, sharing techniques he had developed during his construction. He showed Jacob Webster how to improve chinking using his clay horsehair resin mixture. He explained to Michael Fraser how roof supports could be strengthened by distributing loads across multiple connection points rather than relying on individual poles to bear concentrated weight. He suggested to Thomas Garrett that moving firewood under cover before heavy snow would prevent access problems during storms. Most trappers accepted his advice politely, but declined to invest the effort required for implementation. The techniques Matthias suggested required time and work that seemed excessive given uncertain need. If the winter proved severe, they would deal with problems as they arose. That approach had worked adequately in previous years. Garrett thanked Matthias for his concern, but pointed out that his cabin had survived 9 winters already and would probably survive another. Webster felt his roof reinforcement was sufficient without adopting Matthias's more complex methods. Fraser had enough firewood stacked outside and did not see value in building covered storage. Only one trapper took Matthias's advice seriously. Daniel Murphy, relatively new to the region with only 2 winters' experience, had heard stories about Matthias's unusual cabin. The storm arrived on January 9, 1845, beginning as light snow that seemed unremarkable to experienced mountain men. By midday, the snowfall had intensified significantly, and wind began gusting from the northwest. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Visibility decreased until trappers could barely see 50 feet from their cabin doors. Most men simply settled inside, confident the storm would pass by morning, as mountain weather typically did. The storm did not pass. It intensified through the night and continued through the following day without pause. Snow fell at rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour, sustained across 48 consecutive hours. Wind speeds reached 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70. The combination created whiteout conditions where distinguishing ground from sky became impossible. Temperature held steady at 10 below zero, cold enough to kill anyone exposed for extended periods. Matthias watched from his cliff shelter as the storm demonstrated its power. The granite overhang completely protected his cabin from snow accumulation. Wind struck the cliff face and deflected upward, creating a relatively calm zone beneath the overhang. He could stand in his protected work area and observe the storm raging 50 feet away while remaining untouched by it. His firewood remained accessible and dry. His cabin interior stayed warm, with modest fire maintained in his stone fireplace. In the valley below, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Standard cabin roofs began accumulating snow at catastrophic rates. By the second day, most structures bore loads exceeding 1,000 pounds distributed across roof surfaces designed for half that weight. Support poles began cracking under stress. Some roofs sagged visibly, creating interior conditions where occupants feared collapse at any moment. Several families evacuated their cabins and crowded into structures that seemed more stable, increasing occupancy beyond what small spaces could reasonably accommodate. The third day brought no relief. Snow accumulation in open areas reached 5 feet depth. Drifts against cabin walls climbed to 8 feet or higher, completely burying doors and windows. Families trapped inside their cabins began digging through snow to create exit tunnels, desperate to maintain access to firewood supplies that were now buried under massive drifts. Several men attempting to dig to their firewood suffered frostbite. One trapper, attempting to reach his buried woodpile during brief visibility improvement, became disoriented in the storm and died from exposure less than 100 yards from his cabin. On the fourth day, the first roof collapsed. Jacob Webster's cabin, which had survived 9 previous winters, failed under snow load estimated at 1,500 pounds. The roof structure broke catastrophically, falling into the interior while Webster and his wife were inside. They escaped injury only by luck, having been near the door when failure occurred. They abandoned the destroyed cabin and fought through the storm to reach Michael Fraser's structure half a mile away, a journey that took 2 hours and nearly killed both of them. 2 more roofs collapsed on the 5th day as snow load continued increasing beyond any weight mountain cabins were designed to bear. The storm finally broke on the morning of January 14th, after 5 days of continuous snowfall. The sky cleared to brilliant blue, temperature remained brutally cold at 15 below zero, and the landscape had transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow depth in open areas measured between 6 and 8 feet. Drifts against any vertical surface reached 10 to 15 feet. The valley where most trappers maintained their camps appeared as a smooth white plain, with occasional irregular lumps indicating buried structures. Matthias emerged from his cabin into the protected zone beneath the overhang and assessed the situation. His immediate area was completely clear. The granite overhang had shed its snow load outward throughout the storm, creating a drift that crested 35 feet from the cliff face, but left the area near his cabin untouched. He could walk freely in the protected zone. His firewood remained accessible and dry. His cabin had experienced no stress whatsoever. He looked down at the valley and recognized that people were in serious trouble. Smoke rose from only 3 locations, indicating that most cabins either had damaged chimneys or their occupants had been forced to evacuate. Matthias gathered emergency supplies, strapped on snowshoes he had made during the previous winter, and began the difficult descent to the valley. The snow was deep and unstable, creating exhausting travel conditions, but his elevated position gave him an advantage in seeing the overall situation. The first cabin he reached belonged to Thomas Garrett. Garrett and 2 other families had crowded into the structure after their own cabins became uninhabitable. 8 people occupied a space designed for 2, sharing limited firewood and food. Garrett's cabin had survived with roof damage but no catastrophic failure. However, the occupants were running low on fuel and supplies after 5 days of consumption at 4 times normal rate. Matthias helped dig out their buried firewood supply and assisted in reinforcing Garrett's damaged roof using techniques he had attempted to share months earlier. Michael Fraser's situation was more serious. His cabin had not collapsed, but the door was buried under 12 feet of drifted snow. Fraser and 4 other people trapped inside had been slowly digging an exit tunnel, but progress was minimal, and they were nearly out of firewood. Matthias organized the digging from outside, creating an efficient tunnel that reached the door within 3 hours. Once opened, he discovered that Fraser's group had been surviving on minimal heat, burning furniture to extend their firewood when the supply ran out. 2 people showed signs of early frostbite. Jacob Webster's collapsed cabin was a total loss. Webster and his wife were sheltering with Fraser, but had lost all their winter supplies and equipment. Matthias offered them temporary accommodation in his cliff cabin until they could make other arrangements. The offer surprised everyone who heard it, given Matthias's reputation for isolation. The 5-day blizzard of January 1845 fundamentally changed how trappers in the Colorado high country approached cabin construction. The catastrophic failures that occurred during that storm could not be dismissed as bad luck or isolated incidents. 3 roofs had collapsed completely. 7 more showed serious structural damage. 2 men had died from exposure-related causes. Dozens of people had suffered frostbite or other cold injuries. The economic losses from destroyed cabins and buried supplies exceeded $5,000 across the scattered community. In contrast, Matthias's cliff-integrated cabin had experienced no problems whatsoever. This disparity was impossible to ignore or explain away. Men who had mocked Keller's cave as excessive and impractical now recognized it as the only structure in the region that had been genuinely prepared for severe conditions. The name Keller's Cave persisted, but the mocking tone disappeared. People began using it as a reference standard, describing their own structures in comparison to Matthias's design. During the spring of 1845, several trappers approached Matthias requesting advice on rebuilding. Jacob Webster, whose cabin had collapsed, asked if Matthias would help him select a site with similar geological advantages. Thomas Garrett wanted to understand the thermal mass principles that had allowed Matthias to use so much less firewood than standard cabins. Michael Fraser asked detailed questions about chinking composition and roof design suited to heavy snow loads. Matthias shared his knowledge freely and without reservation. He took Webster on a survey of the surrounding terrain, teaching him how to evaluate cliff formations for stability, overhang geometry, and thermal orientation. He showed Garrett exactly how his fireplace was positioned against the cliff face and explained how the blackened stone absorbed and retained heat. He gave Fraser specific measurements and techniques for creating superior chinking that would not crack or fall out over time. By autumn of 1845, 3 new cabins were under construction, using principles derived from Matthias's design. Webster found a smaller overhang that still provided significant protection, and built a cabin integrated with the cliff face, using techniques Matthias had demonstrated. Garrett rebuilt his valley cabin using conventional location, but incorporated thermal mass principles by building his fireplace against a large boulder and using superior chinking throughout. Fraser reinforced his repaired cabin and added a covered firewood storage area inspired by Matthias's protected zone beneath the overhang. The results varied based on how completely each builder adopted the underlying principles. Webster's cliff-integrated design performed excellently, surviving the following winter with minimal problems. Garrett's thermal mass improvements reduced his firewood consumption noticeably, but could not match the advantages of full geological integration. Fraser's reinforcements prevented roof failure, but did not address the fundamental vulnerabilities of exposed valley construction. Word of these successful adaptations spread through the regional trapping network. By 1847, variations of cliff-integrated cabin design were appearing throughout the Colorado and Wyoming high country. Not every trapper adopted the techniques, as they required significant additional time and effort during construction. But those who faced serious bear threats, worked in areas prone to heavy snow, or simply valued long-term durability over quick construction, began building what the community now called Keller-style cabins. Matthias Keller left the Colorado mountains in 1851 after nearly 2 decades of trapping. The fur trade had declined severely by that point, with beaver populations depleted and market demand collapsed. He was 40 years old, had saved substantial money, and felt ready for a less isolated existence. He traveled to the Oregon Territory and purchased land near the Willamette Valley, establishing a small farm where he lived quietly for the remainder of his life. He married in 1853 to a widow named Catherine Brennan, who had traveled west with her family. They had 2 children who survived to adulthood. Matthias farmed, did carpentry work for neighbors, and participated in community affairs with the same methodical competence he had demonstrated in the mountains. People who knew him in Oregon never learned about his mountain years or the cabin design innovation that had saved lives. To his family and community, he was simply a reliable farmer and skilled carpenter. Matthias died in 1869 at age 58 from pneumonia that developed after working in cold rain. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, birth, and death years, and nothing more. His children knew he had been a trapper before farming, but had no detailed knowledge of that life. The specific stories of Ernst Vogel's death, the cliff cabin construction, and the 5-day blizzard were never shared with them. In the Colorado mountains, the cabin Matthias had built remained standing and occupied for decades after his departure. A prospector used it during the mining boom of the 1860s. A hunter maintained it as a base camp through the 1870s. In 1883, a detailed survey of frontier structures conducted by a military engineer specifically noted the cabin's exceptional construction and integration with natural features. The survey report described it as an example of superior frontier engineering and recommended similar techniques for remote military outposts. By 1900, approximately 40 cabins throughout the Rocky Mountain region had been built using principles directly derived from Matthias's original design. These structures shared common features, including cliff integration for weather protection, thermal mass systems for heating efficiency, protected storage areas, and superior construction techniques that prioritize durability over speed. The exact number of lives saved by these improved shelters cannot be determined with certainty, but historical records document at least 17 specific incidents where people survived extreme weather in cliff-integrated cabins, while neighboring standard structures failed catastrophically. The broader legacy extended beyond specific structures. Matthias had demonstrated that frontier survival often depended more on thoughtful preparation than on physical toughness or quick reactions. His approach of studying problems systematically, learning from failures, and investing time in superior solutions influenced how some frontiersmen approached wilderness challenges. The principle that good engineering could eliminate dangers before they became crises proved applicable far beyond cabin construction. Modern historians studying frontier innovation occasionally encounter references to Keller-style cabins in period documents and recognize them as examples of practical engineering developed through observation rather than formal training.